My stepfather manipulated medical records to cut me out of the inheritance. The will was reinstated, and he went to prison. The hospice nurse handed me the medication log, and my mother's signature was on it from 3 days after she died. Not a similar signature, not something that could be explained away as a clerical error, but her actual distinctive signature with the little loop she always made on the capital L of her name, dated April 18th, when she'd been dead and cremated since April 15th. My hands went numb holding that clipboard, because I was looking at proof that someone had been falsifying documents during my mother's final days, and the only person with access and motive was my stepfather Jeffrey Mercer, who was currently in the process of inheriting her entire $8 million estate while I got nothing. The nurse, a kind woman named Patricia Delgado, who'd been caring for my mother for 6 weeks, looked at me with concern and asked if I was okay, and I couldn't answer because my brain was trying to process the fact that the man my mother had married 4 years ago had apparently been forging her signature while she was dying of pancreatic cancer, and I had no idea how deep the deception went or what else he'd manipulated. I should start at the beginning, back when my mother was healthy, and Jeffrey Mercer was just the charming older gentleman she'd met at a charity gala. My name is Nathan Cross, and I'd been living a relatively normal life as a financial analyst in Chicago for 6 years, when my mother, Linda Cross, started dating Jeffrey in early 2019. My father had died of a heart attack when I was 19, leaving my mother a widow at 48, with a substantial inheritance from his successful career as a commercial real estate developer. She'd spent a decade alone, focusing on philanthropic work and managing the foundation my father had established, and I'd been genuinely happy when she told me she'd met someone. Jeffrey was 62, a semi-retired investment banker, well-dressed and articulate, with the kind of old money manners that put people at ease. He seemed to make my mother happy, took her to the theater and on trips to Europe, and treated her with visible affection and respect. They married in June 2020, a small ceremony at our family home in Lake Forest, Illinois, delayed slightly by the pandemic, but ultimately going forward with just close family and friends. I was cautiously supportive, having vetted Jeffrey as thoroughly as I could without being insulting. He had money of his own, or so it seemed, with a condo in Gold Coast and what appeared to be a comfortable lifestyle. He didn't need my mother's money, which was the main thing that concerned me. The wedding was lovely. My mother looked happier than I'd seen her in years, and Jeffrey gave a toast about how lucky he was to find love again at his age. I remember thinking that maybe this would work out, that my mother deserved companionship in her later years, that I should let go of the protective instinct that made me scrutinize every man who showed interest in her. The first sign that something was wrong came about 18 months into their marriage, in late 2021. My mother mentioned casually during a phone call that she'd updated her will, that it was just routine maintenance now that she was remarried, nothing for me to worry about. I asked if she'd used the family attorney, David Thornton, who'd handled my father's estate and all our legal matters for 25 years, and she said no, that Jeffrey had recommended someone he knew, a lawyer named Raymond Kellerman, who specialized in estate planning. Something about that bothered me, but I couldn't articulate why. It made sense that a new marriage would necessitate will updates, and Jeffrey would naturally know estate attorneys through his banking connections. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I needed to trust my mother's judgment and not treat her like she was incapable of making her own decisions. But the discomfort persisted. Over the next few months, I noticed small changes in my mother's behavior and circumstances. She seemed less engaged when we talked, often distracted or deferring questions to Jeffrey. She stopped hosting the annual holiday gatherings at the house, saying it was too much work, which was unlike her because she'd always loved entertaining. She mentioned selling some of her jewelry, pieces that had sentimental value, saying she was downsizing and didn't need so much stuff anymore. Each individual thing seemed reasonable, but together, they painted a picture of someone gradually withdrawing from her previous life, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Jeffrey's influence was driving these changes. I tried to raise my concerns delicately during a visit in March 2022, asking if everything was okay, if she was happy. She assured me she was fine, that Jeffrey was wonderful, that I was worrying too much. She looked me in the eye when she said it, and I wanted to believe her. Then, in July 2022, my mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, stage 4, already metastasized to her liver. The prognosis was brutal, 12 to 18 months with aggressive treatment, maybe 6 months without. She chose treatment, chemotherapy, and radiation, trying every option to buy herself more time. Jeffrey was attentive during this period, attending doctor appointments with her, arranging for home care, doing all the things a devoted husband should do. I flew home every other weekend to spend time with her, watching her decline gradually, her vibrant energy draining away as the cancer and the treatments ravaged her body. During those visits, Jeffrey was always present, always helpful, always positioning himself as her primary caregiver and decision-maker. I appreciated his support initially, grateful that she had someone with her full-time when I couldn't be there. But over time, his constant presence started to feel less like devotion and more like control. I noticed that my mother rarely spoke to me alone anymore. Jeffrey would hover during my visits, interjecting in our conversations, answering questions I'd directed to her. When I tried to get time alone with her, suggesting we have lunch just the two of us or that she call me privately sometime, there was always a reason why that couldn't happen. She was too tired, or she had a doctor's appointment, or Jeffrey had already made plans. The few times I did manage to speak with her without him in the room, she seemed anxious, constantly glancing at the door, cutting conversations short. I asked her directly in November 2022 if Jeffrey was preventing her from talking to me, and she looked genuinely shocked, said of course not, that I was reading too much into things, that the cancer was making her tired and scattered. I wanted to believe her, but the anxiety in her eyes told a different story. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. The second major red flag came in January 2023, when I received a letter from David Thornton, our longtime family attorney. He said he'd been trying to reach my mother for several months regarding some estate planning questions and had been repeatedly told she wasn't available. He'd finally managed to speak with her briefly, and she'd told him that Raymond Kellerman was now handling all her legal affairs and he should direct any questions there. David said this was unusual, that he'd worked with our family for decades and was concerned about the sudden change, especially given her medical situation. He asked if I knew anything about Kellerman or why my mother would switch attorneys. I didn't have good answers, but I promised to look into it. The conversation left me deeply uneasy because David Thornton was scrupulously ethical and not prone to unnecessary alarm, and if he thought something was wrong, it probably was. I tried to investigate Raymond Kellerman discreetly. Basic internet searches showed he was a licensed attorney in Illinois, had been practicing for about 15 years, specialized in estate planning and probate. Nothing immediately suspicious, but also nothing that explained why my mother would abandon a trusted advisor for someone Jeffrey had recommended. I considered hiring a private investigator, but decided that was too extreme, that I'd confront my mother and Jeffrey directly instead. During my next visit in late January, I asked to see the updated will, said I wanted to understand the estate plan to ensure everything was in order. Jeffrey reacted poorly, said it was none of my business, that my mother's affairs were private, that I was being invasive and disrespectful. My mother, sitting in her wheelchair looking frail and exhausted, said quietly that everything was handled appropriately, that I shouldn't worry. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut, and I backed off rather than upset her further, but I left that visit convinced that something was very wrong. My mother's condition deteriorated rapidly in February and March 2023. The cancer had progressed despite treatment, and her doctors recommended transitioning to hospice care. She moved to a hospice facility in early March, a beautiful private room with windows overlooking a garden, and the staff was compassionate and professional. Jeffrey arranged everything, handled all the logistics, and positioned himself as her sole decision-maker through his power of attorney for healthcare. I visited as often as I could, sitting with her during her lucid moments, holding her hand while she slept, trying to make peace with the fact that I was losing her. She was heavily medicated by this point, mostly unconscious, and when she was awake, she was confused and disoriented. Jeffrey was there constantly, sleeping in her room, monitoring her care, and while part of me appreciated his dedication, another part wondered what he was protecting or controlling. She died on April 15, 2023, with Jeffrey at her bedside. I'd been there the day before, had said my goodbyes not knowing they were final, and I got the call at 6 in the morning that she was gone. The grief was overwhelming, expected but still crushing, and I spent the next few days in a fog of funeral arrangements and condolence calls. Jeffrey handled most of the logistics, which I appreciated because I couldn't function well enough to make decisions about flowers and reception venues. The funeral was on April 19th, a beautiful service at the church my mother had attended, and Jeffrey gave a moving eulogy about their love and the joy she'd brought to his life. I cried through the entire service, mourning not just her death, but the distance that had grown between us in her final years, the feeling that I'd lost her long before the cancer took her. The reading of the will happened a week later, on April 26th, in Raymond Kellerman's office in downtown Chicago. I sat across from Kellerman, a smooth-talking man in his late 40s with expensive suits and practiced sympathy, while he explained the terms of my mother's estate. She'd left everything to Jeffrey: the house, the investment accounts, the foundation, all of it, totaling approximately $8 million. I received nothing, not even a token bequest or sentimental item. Kellerman explained that this was my mother's clear intention, executed in a will dated November 2021 and updated in a codicil from February 2023, both properly witnessed and notarized. He said she'd made this decision because she trusted Jeffrey to manage her legacy and because she felt I was financially stable and didn't need her money. The words hit me like physical blows because my mother and I had always been close, and the idea that she'd intentionally disinherited me completely was incomprehensible. I asked to see the documents, and Kellerman slid copies across his desk. The signature looked like my mother's. The language was formal but clear, and there were witness signatures and notary stamps that appeared legitimate. I asked if I could contest the will, and Kellerman said I was certainly entitled to try, but that contesting a properly executed will was difficult and expensive, and there was no evidence of undue influence or lack of capacity. He said this with the kind of smooth confidence that made it clear he'd been through this conversation before, that he was prepared for my objections. Jeffrey sat next to him, silent and solemn, occasionally dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief, the picture of a grieving widower respecting his late wife's wishes. I left that office feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach, unable to process what had just happened. I called David Thornton from my car in the parking garage, told him what had occurred. He was quiet for a long moment, then said, "This didn't sound right. that he'd known my mother for decades, and she'd always intended for me to inherit the bulk of her estate, that she'd told him explicitly multiple times over the years. He said the November 2021 date was suspicious because that was shortly after she'd married Jeffrey, when she might have been most vulnerable to pressure or manipulation. He recommended I hire a probate attorney immediately, someone who specialized in will contests, because if there was foul play, we needed to move fast before assets were distributed. He gave me the name of an attorney named Victoria Sterling, said she was a bulldog in probate litigation, and that I should contact her immediately. I made the appointment for the following day, desperate for someone to tell me this could be fixed. Victoria Sterling was in her early 50s, with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind, and she listened to my story without interruption while taking detailed notes. When I finished, she asked if I had any evidence of undue influence or fraud, anything concrete beyond my gut feeling that something was wrong. I said no, just the suspicious timing and the fact that it contradicted everything I'd known about my mother's intentions. Victoria said that wasn't enough to win a will contest, that I'd need to prove either that my mother lacked capacity when she signed the documents, or that Jeffrey had exerted undue influence, and both were extremely difficult to establish. She said the best approach was to start investigating, to request copies of all medical records from the period when the will was executed, to interview people who'd interacted with my mother, to look for any evidence that supported a fraud claim. She quoted me a retainer of $25,000 and estimated total costs could reach 6 figures if it went to trial. I agreed without hesitation, because this wasn't about the money anymore, it was about the truth. The investigation started slowly. Victoria filed a formal challenge to the will in probate court, which triggered a stay on distribution of assets and bought us time. She hired a private investigator named Carl Ostrowski, a former Chicago PD detective with 30 years of experience, to dig into Jeffrey's background and timeline. She requested my mother's complete medical records from the hospital and hospice facility, looking for evidence of her mental state during the relevant time periods, and she started interviewing people who'd known my mother, trying to build a picture of her intentions and whether Jeffrey had isolated or manipulated her. The process was exhausting and expensive, and for the first few weeks we found nothing conclusive. Jeffrey had been careful, had covered his tracks well, and everyone we spoke to said he'd seemed like a devoted husband who took good care of my mother. The break came in late May, about 6 weeks into the investigation. Carl Ostrowski discovered that Jeffrey Mercer wasn't actually a semi-retired investment banker with independent wealth. He'd declared bankruptcy in 2017, had been living off credit cards and loans for years, and had been actively looking for a wealthy widow to marry when he'd met my mother. Carl found social media messages and emails from before their marriage where Jeffrey discussed his financial desperation with a friend, talked about needing to find a solution to his money problems, and mentioned targeting charity events because that's where wealthy single women congregated. The messages were damning, showing clear premeditation and intent to defraud, but they didn't prove he'd manipulated the will. They did, however, establish motive, which was a crucial piece of the puzzle. Around the same time, Victoria received my mother's medical records from the hospice facility. She had a medical expert, Dr. Philip Greenberg, a geriatric psychiatrist with 40 years of experience, review them to assess my mother's cognitive capacity during her final months. Dr. Greenberg found something immediately suspicious. The records showed my mother had been receiving extremely high doses of morphine and sedatives during February 2023, when the codicil to the will had been signed. The dosage levels were high enough that she would have been significantly impaired, possibly unconscious or delirious, and definitely not capable of understanding complex legal documents. Dr. Greenberg was willing to testify that based on the medical records, my mother lacked testamentary capacity during that time period, which would invalidate the codicil. It wasn't enough to invalidate the entire will, but it was a significant crack in Kellerman's story. Then Victoria noticed something else in the hospice records. There were medication logs that required patient signatures acknowledging receipt of certain controlled substances. My mother's signature appeared on these logs regularly through April 18th, 3 days after she'd died. Victoria brought this to my attention during a meeting in early June, and I felt the blood drain from my face. I'd been with my mother during her final days, had seen how incapacitated she was, and I knew for certain she couldn't have signed anything in the 72 hours before her death, let alone after it. Someone had been forging her signature, and the most likely suspect was Jeffrey, who'd been present around the clock and had access to all her medical documents. Victoria moved fast. She contacted the hospice facility and requested the original medication logs, not copies, for forensic analysis. She hired a handwriting expert named Dr. Melissa Tran, a forensic document examiner with credentials from the American Board of Forensic Document Examiners, to analyze the signatures, and she notified the Cook County State's Attorney's Office that we had evidence of possible fraud and forgery in connection with a will execution. The state's attorney assigned an investigator, a prosecutor named Julia Warren, with a reputation for being tenacious in elder abuse cases, to review the evidence and determine if criminal charges were warranted. Things were escalating beyond a civil will contest into potential criminal territory, and I could see Jeffrey's carefully constructed facade starting to crack. The forensic analysis came back in mid-June, and it was explosive. Dr. Tran examined the medication logs and the will documents, comparing them to known authentic samples of my mother's signature from before her illness. She concluded with high confidence that multiple signatures on the medication logs from late March and April were forgeries, created by the same person attempting to mimic my mother's handwriting. More importantly, she found that the signature on the February 2023 codicil to the will showed similar characteristics to the forged medication log signatures, suggesting they were created by the same forger. The signature on the November 2021 will was harder to assess because we had fewer comparison points from that time period, but Dr. Tran noted several anomalies that raised questions about its authenticity. Her report was detailed, technical, and devastating to Jeffrey's claims. Armed with this evidence, Victoria filed an emergency motion to freeze all of my mother's assets and to prevent Jeffrey from accessing or distributing anything pending resolution of the fraud allegations. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Eleanor Blackwood, who'd been on the probate bench for 18 years, reviewed the forensic evidence and granted the motion. Jeffrey was effectively cut off from the inheritance he'd been counting on, unable to touch the money or the house, and I could imagine his panic as his entire plan unraveled. Kellerman, the estate attorney, suddenly became much less cooperative, referring all questions to his own legal counsel, clearly worried about his own liability for having participated in what looked increasingly like a criminal conspiracy. Julia Warren from the state's attorney's office interviewed me extensively in late June. She was methodical and tough, pressing me on every detail, making sure I wasn't exaggerating or misremembering events. She spoke with the hospice staff, particularly Patricia Delgado, the nurse who'd first shown me the medication logs with the impossible signatures. Patricia confirmed that she'd had concerns about Jeffrey's behavior during my mother's final days, that he'd been unusually controlling about who had access to my mother and when, that he'd been present for all medication administrations and had often handled the paperwork himself. Patricia said she'd documented her concerns in her personal notes, but hadn't reported them officially because she hadn't had concrete evidence of wrongdoing at the time. Her testimony was crucial because it established Jeffrey's opportunity to forge the signatures and his pattern of controlling access to my mother. The investigation expanded. Julia Warren subpoenaed Jeffrey's financial records and discovered he'd been in even worse shape than Karl Ostrowski had initially found. He owed over $300,000 to various creditors, was being sued by 2 former business partners for fraud, and had a judgment against him from a previous bankruptcy proceeding. He'd been living entirely on credit and my mother's money since they'd married, and without the inheritance, he'd be financially destroyed. Julia also found evidence that Jeffrey had taken out life insurance policies on my mother shortly after they'd married, naming himself as beneficiary, policies that would pay out another $2 million. The pattern was clear. Jeffrey had married my mother specifically for her money, had systematically isolated her from family and advisors, and had manipulated her will and medical records to ensure he'd inherit everything. The criminal charges came in early July. The Cook County State's Attorney's Office filed charges against Jeffrey Mercer, including forgery, fraud, exploitation of an elderly or disabled person, and tampering with public records. They also charged Raymond Kellerman as an accomplice to fraud, alleging he'd knowingly participated in the will manipulation scheme. Kellerman immediately cut a deal, agreeing to testify against Jeffrey in exchange for reduced charges, and his testimony was damning. He confirmed that Jeffrey had approached him in 2021, specifically asking for help creating a will that would disinherit me, that Jeffrey had brought documents with my mother's signature that Kellerman now suspected were forged, and that Jeffrey had pressured him to execute the February 2023 codicil despite Kellerman's concerns about my mother's capacity. Kellerman claimed he'd been uncomfortable, but had convinced himself it was legitimate because Jeffrey was her husband and had power of attorney. Jeffrey was arrested on July 12, 2023, at my mother's house, which he'd been living in despite the asset freeze. The news coverage was extensive because it had all the elements of a good story: wealthy widow, scheming husband, stolen inheritance, forged documents. I watched the footage of Jeffrey being led out in handcuffs, looking nothing like the polished gentleman I'd met 4 years earlier, and felt a complicated mix of vindication and sadness. Vindication because I'd been right to trust my instincts, because the system had worked and the fraud had been exposed. Sadness because my mother had been manipulated and betrayed by someone she'd trusted, because her final years had been tainted by Jeffrey's deception, because I couldn't protect her from it. The trial was set for October, and the prosecution's case was overwhelming. They presented the forensic evidence of forged signatures, the financial records showing Jeffrey's motive, the testimony from hospice staff about his controlling behavior, Kellerman's confession about the fraudulent will execution, and the medical expert testimony that my mother lacked capacity during key time periods. Jeffrey's defense attorney, a public defender named Alan Foster who seemed thoroughly out of his depth, tried to argue that Jeffrey had genuinely loved my mother and had only been following her wishes, but the evidence against that narrative was insurmountable. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The sentencing hearing was in November, and I gave a victim impact statement in court. I talked about my mother, about who she'd been before Jeffrey entered her life, about the vibrant, generous woman who'd raised me alone after my father died, who'd built a foundation to help others, who deserved to spend her final years in peace and dignity. I talked about how Jeffrey had stolen that from her, had isolated her from family, had manipulated her when she was most vulnerable, had forged her signature even after her death to steal what didn't belong to him. I talked about the grief of losing her twice, first to his manipulation and then to cancer, about how I'd never get those final years back, about how his greed had poisoned everything. The judge, A stern man named Harold Zimmerman, who'd been on the bench for 26 years, listened without expression, and then sentenced Jeffrey to 12 years in state prison for the combined charges. It was a substantial sentence, reflecting the seriousness of exploiting a dying woman, and I felt a grim satisfaction watching Jeffrey's face as it was announced. The probate case wrapped up quickly after the criminal conviction. With Jeffrey's fraud exposed and Kellerman's cooperation, there was no one left to defend the November 2021 will or the February 2023 codicil. Victoria filed a motion to invalidate both documents and to reinstate my mother's previous will from 2018, the one David Thornton had drafted years before Jeffrey entered the picture. That will left the majority of the estate to me, with provisions for continued funding of my father's foundation and some charitable bequests. Judge Blackwood granted the motion in December 2023, officially reinstating the 2018 will and naming me as the primary beneficiary of my mother's estate. After legal fees and costs, I inherited approximately $7.2 million, the house, and control of the foundation. It was what my mother had always intended, what should have happened without Jeffrey's interference, and while I was relieved, I felt no joy in it. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. The financial recovery was complex. The life insurance companies initially fought paying out the policies Jeffrey had taken on my mother, arguing that his criminal conviction voided his claims. That was tied up in litigation for months before they finally settled, and the policies were paid to the estate rather than to Jeffrey. Victoria went after everything Jeffrey had taken during the marriage, every joint account he'd emptied, every asset he'd transferred, and we recovered most of it through civil forfeiture proceedings. By the time everything was settled in mid-2024, the estate was largely intact, and I'd become the custodian of my mother's legacy in the way she'd always planned. I had to make decisions about what to do with it all. I kept the house in Lake Forest initially, spending time there going through my mother's belongings, trying to reconnect with her memory in spaces Jeffrey had contaminated. I found letters she'd written to me but never sent, letters from when she was first sick and still lucid, telling me she loved me and was proud of me and wanted me to know that whatever happened, I was her priority. Reading those letters, I cried harder than I had at her funeral, because they were proof that Jeffrey had stolen her voice in her final months, had prevented her from communicating her true wishes. I found journals from early in their marriage where she'd documented feeling controlled and isolated, where she'd written about wanting to reach out to me but being afraid of Jeffrey's reaction. She'd known something was wrong but hadn't been strong enough to fight back, especially once the cancer made her physically vulnerable. I hired a new director for the foundation, someone with experience in philanthropic management, and expanded its mission to include funding for elder abuse prevention programs. It felt right, taking the pain of what Jeffrey had done and transforming it into something that might protect other families from similar exploitation. We partnered with legal aid organizations to provide free will review services for seniors, funded training for healthcare workers on recognizing signs of financial abuse, and created public awareness campaigns about the dangers of isolation and manipulation. My mother would have approved, I think, of taking her money and using it to prevent others from experiencing what she'd gone through. The criminal case had ripple effects beyond Jeffrey's conviction. The Illinois Attorney General's office launched an investigation into Raymond Kellerman's law practice and found evidence of multiple other questionable will executions and estate plans that appeared designed to benefit people other than the testator's original intentions. Kellerman's law license was suspended pending a full ethics investigation, and several other families came forward with suspicious circumstances similar to ours. The case became something of a landmark in Illinois for elder financial abuse prosecution, cited in subsequent cases, and used as a teaching example in legal ethics courses. Something good came from the horror, though it could never undo the damage. Jeffrey filed appeals, of course, claiming ineffective counsel and arguing that the evidence had been insufficient. Every appeal was denied, and he remains in prison serving his 12-year sentence. He'll be eligible for parole in about 8 years, in 2031, assuming good behavior. I get notifications about his status through the Victim Services Program, and I've prepared a statement opposing parole for when that time comes. He destroyed my mother's final years, stole her agency when she was dying, and forged her signature after her death. That kind of calculated cruelty deserves the full sentence, and I'll fight any early release. My own recovery took time. I went to therapy, working through the complicated grief of losing my mother and the anger about how she'd been treated. Dr. Raymond Fisher, a psychologist specializing in family trauma, helped me understand that my guilt about not protecting her was misplaced, that Jeffrey was a sophisticated predator who'd specifically targeted someone vulnerable, that I'd done everything I reasonably could with the information I had. The therapy helped, though I still have moments where I think about things I could have done differently, conversations I should have pushed harder, warning signs I should have acted on sooner. Dr. Fisher says that's normal, that survivors of this kind of betrayal often carry unwarranted responsibility, and that healing is about accepting that I'm not omnipotent and couldn't have prevented everything. I think about my mother often, trying to separate the woman she actually was from the image Jeffrey tried to create of her as someone who'd willingly disinherit her own son. The evidence showed clearly what happened. Jeffrey isolated her, controlled her access to outside support, manipulated her when she was physically and cognitively compromised, and then forged documents to complete the theft. She was a victim, not a willing participant, and she loved me until the very end. Those letters I found, written in her own hand when she was still herself, prove that. I keep one on my desk, a reminder of who she really was and why fighting for the truth mattered. The house in Lake Forest sold in early 2024. I couldn't live there, couldn't be in spaces where Jeffrey had exerted his control over my mother, where she'd spent her final months trapped in a marriage that was really a long con. A family with young children bought it, and I was glad to see it go to people who'd fill it with life and warmth instead of manipulation and death. I used some of the proceeds to buy a smaller place for myself in Chicago, invested the rest conservatively, and focused on building a life that honored my mother's memory without being consumed by what Jeffrey had done. Looking back now, almost 2 years after my mother's death, I can see how all the pieces fit together. Jeffrey's bankruptcy in 2017 led him to target wealthy widows. Meeting my mother at that charity gala in 2019 was strategic, not serendipitous. The quick marriage was about securing access and establishing legal rights. The isolation from family and advisors was about preventing interference. The will changes were about ensuring the payoff. And the forgeries during her final days were about tying up loose ends and maintaining control even as she was dying. It was all calculated, all intentional, all designed to extract maximum wealth with minimum risk. He just didn't count on a suspicious son who wouldn't let go and a legal system that actually worked when presented with clear evidence. The phrase, elder financial abuse, sounds abstract until it's your own mother, until you're watching someone systematically rob her of agency and dignity while pretending to care for her, until you're fighting legal battles while grieving her death and questioning whether you could have saved her. The statistics say that financial exploitation of elders is vastly underreported, that most cases never come to light because families don't know what happened or can't prove it. I was lucky, if you can call it that, to have resources to fight back, to hire good lawyers and forensic experts, to pursue justice through both criminal and civil systems. Most families don't have those resources, and predators like Jeffrey know that and exploit it. I hope my mother knew, in whatever moments of clarity she had at the end, that I was fighting for her, that I didn't believe the lie that she'd chosen to disinherit me, that I loved her enough to see through Jeffrey's performance and pursue the truth. I hope she knew she wasn't alone, even when he'd isolated her physically. The letters suggest she did know, that she held on to the hope that I'd figure it out eventually, and that has to be enough. I can't bring her back, can't give her the peaceful final years she deserved, but I could expose what was done to her and ensure Jeffrey faced consequences. That matters. It has to matter. The will was reinstated. The estate was recovered. The truth was exposed. Jeffrey went to prison. In the end, justice was served, though it came too late to save my mother from the betrayal. She trusted the wrong person, and it cost her everything in her final months. But her true will, the one that reflected her actual values and intentions, was ultimately honored. Her son inherited what she'd wanted him to have. Her foundation continues her philanthropic work, and the man who manipulated her medical records to steal her legacy is locked in a cell where he can't hurt anyone else. The legal system worked, the truth won, and Jeffrey Mercer lost everything, including his freedom, because he was never satisfied with what he had and always wanted what wasn't his to take. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.